Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. We're incredibly fortunate to have a panel of three of the brightest creative minds in the media, in the film business. And I'll ask these guys to talk a little bit about who they are and what they do. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the way that narratives are changing due to all of the disruptive technologies, and it's have a fun conversation, and then open it up for Q&A. So, I forgot to say, I'm Susan Margolin.
Hi, I'm sitting to Susan's left. My name is Michael Costigan. I graduated in 1990, and I was reminding somebody I graduated with 28 credits. I literally squeaked out of here. So, thanks for having me.
Holly Sklar. When I was at Brown, one of the things that I did that I really loved was I was president of the Brown Film Society for a year, and then always involved with it the whole time I was here. And I got to show movies every Friday night, 2 movies, sometimes midnight movies too, and that was a tremendous film education. And I use that every day. I'm a story analyst at Warner Brothers Pictures. I've been there for 13 years. I was a development executive at the Ladd Company. I've also had some screenplays go through screenplay development hell. And love what I do, and wish my kids were here to see it, but hopefully we'll tape it and they get to participate.
We'll film it for them.
So I'm in Kinberg, class of 95. I did not study film when I was here and didn't really know that it's what I was going to end up doing. I studied literature and kind of nothing else. I think 30 of my 32 classes were in the English department, and one of them was in Egyptology. So I kind of turned this place into like a little grad school for myself. And then when I left, I tried to be a proper writer, which is what I wanted to do, and I failed at it, and so I ended up being a screenwriter. And that's my job. I'm a screenwriter and a movie producer.
Great. And I was class of 85, majored in semiotics, did an internship at a distribution company to learn how to distribute the documentaries that I was making while I was at Brown, and discovered that I was sort of better suited to deal making than filmmaking. So I started a distribution company called New Video, and sold that after a 20-year run to a company called Cinedigm, and now I'm working at Cinedigm running the documentary business there. So now we can talk a little bit about what's happening in narrative. Recently, Woody Allen signed on to do a 6-part, 6-time half-hour series on Amazon, and shortly thereafter called it a really terrible idea and mistake. So, that's a really interesting sort of example of what's happening now as our media diet is shifting from, being primarily in a movie theater or on a television screen to being, ubiquitous, TV and film everywhere. And that's, having a real, sort of impact on the narrative stories that we tell. Recently, Matt Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, talked about how binge viewing is really something that he laments, because he feels that stories should marinate over time. And he said that he would like to do a series for Netflix and convince them that they should be releasing the episodes with space between them. So, Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts about marination and...
Yeah, absolutely, marination. Well, it's interesting because the way I think everybody's experiencing this, I don't think this is about what we know or what other people know, but how people are experiencing stories and storytelling, and how actually I think some of the boldest material is on television now as opposed to in film, and that even means independent film or studio independent filmmaking. So I do understand what he's saying, because it's true in the binge watching, the way people are seeing content, but on the other hand, you have, let's say, 8, 10, 12 hours with characters. And in a movie, you have 90 minutes, 2 hours, maybe a little bit longer, and the form defines it too. And sometimes it's actually best for a story, actually. Those confines really serve the storytelling and serve the characters. But so many of your favorite characters now are coming from television, I think because you get to spend all of that time with them. So, I don't know, I think as a grumpy movie person, I feel like 10 hours of TV is pretty great, so I'll take it however you can get it, if you binge or if it takes the time. But still, as much as there's binge watching, aside from my wife who can binge watch, I still need space. So I think it's up to the viewer of how you want to experience it. And to sum up, I also think that's the beauty of where we are now. In the culture, what do you want to watch? You have access to it, both to the making and to the watching. I mean, that's what this whole building's about. So it's not like we were all laughing about when you would sign out equipment and have to go buy Super 8 film and you only had the equipment for the weekend. I think it's about how people want to access it. You have choices now. So I think it's more about that.
Great. Holly, do you have thoughts about?
Because I have 10-year-olds, I'm really seeing a change in the viewing habits, and there's a tremendous amount of freedom, but they only know the sort of on-demand world. It's the norm for them. There's a tremendous amount of freedom for the consumer in that, and as much as I think Matthew Weiner is going to make his show special by making us wait for it, I think the majority of filmmakers and content creators are just kind of going to have to go with this on-demand universe that we've moved into. But the nice part of that is, if I want to show my kids classic movies or movies I grew up with, it's very easy for me to find those and have that great experience with them. The other side of the coin is, though, that studios, to get people out of their homes to go see movies, are at least the big studios, having to focus on a lot of spectacle movies, and I still love character-driven movies too. Television has been the place they've kind of migrated to for the most part, except for independent film. But the other nice thing that's happening is a cross-pollination between television and film that didn't used to happen. You kind of worked in one or the other. And I think because the writer is the showrunner in TV, very much, you're getting a lot of great voicey television and a lot of great drama on television, and some of those people go back and forth between the two, and that's kind of a nice thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I have little kids too, 9 and 5, and what I see, it's not necessarily specific to TV and movies, but it's relevant to TV and movies, is there's a different experience than we had when we were kids, which is, I think we had an experience, and even when we were here in college, where you were excited about a movie or a show, and you would experience it in a very sort of, I imagine it like vertical versus horizontal, in a very vertical way, where you would go deep on that one thing. And now I think the experience of life is much more horizontal. Like the way that people learn, cognize, ingest material is like, if you're interested in that, you're in it for a couple minutes and it suddenly taps you to another place, and you tap it to another place. And I think that's true across all sort of media and communication, but it's relevant to TV and movies too. Because a lot of, at least in features, what we do now is create supplementary material to sort of enhance, expand the experience of that one movie. And so in the kinds of films that you're talking about, the spectacle movies, which are often the ones I tend to work on, even though there's 2 years, 3 years between movies, there's tons of different kinds of material that we're creating to sort of buffer and sometimes bridge from movie to movie. So like we create viral material for the internet, we create extra little short films that go on DVDs, we create tags at the end of a different movie for the movie that you're in the process of writing. It's much more horizontal than it was before. And there is a sense, I think to some extent coming from the TV model, that we are creating chapters in a larger tapestry as opposed to a single standing entity.
It's a really great segue to the next question, which is, where so much of our audience on the media side has experience with video games and interactivity. I wondered if you guys could comment about, this transition from the kind of lean back experience of cinema to, how the expectations of the audience for a more, sort of lean forward interactive experience. And, maybe Michael, you could talk a little bit more about that.
Should we reverse order? Wouldn't it be more fun?
Well, Simon just talked about that. But, yeah. No, go ahead.
Whichever way you want to do it, Mike.
I don't know. I feel like Simon is dying to answer this question. I
I just have bad posture. I'm leaning forward because I have bad posture, not because I'm excited. I'm happy to answer it, though, if you want.
Answer it. All right.
Sure.
We'll answer it together.
Okay, well, I actually think those things are still very separate. And it may be different than your opinion. I think that first-person experiences and third-person experiences are still entirely separate experiences. And I think that the video game process, one of the reasons why I think video games haven't adapted well to TV or movies, even though comic books have and other kinds of media have made that leap, is because when you are playing a video game, you are the protagonist. You're not watching as an object a protagonist. You're not empathizing. You are actually there. And I think handing the controls over to a storyteller is a tough thing for gamers. And so I think the experiences are, you either have a first-person experience where you're playing the game and it is you, like you're exercising without physically exercising, or you go somewhere where you want the story to guide you through a narrative process. I mean, one of the there's a lot of new technology I'm sure you guys all know about, but one of them is this thing called the Magic Leap, which is the next step in what is the, what's the sort of fully immersive. Anyway, it's a type of technology where you sit in a box and everywhere you look feels real, and it actually tricks your brain into thinking that you're in that environment. There's one iteration of it, I forgot the name of it. The next one,
Oculus Rift. Yeah.
Oculus, and I think Oculus works great for video games and for watching sports, for fully immersive, interactive types of entertainment. I think for third-person entertainment where you actually want to be guided through a story, it doesn't work particularly well. And I don't think Magic Leap, that new technology, I think, only to me accentuates the fact that first-person and third-person are still, you go to them for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. And one can accentuate the other. I mean, for example, I'm sure in films you're doing, or some of these others, to be in the point of view is interesting, but that's not going to feel like a fully satisfying story. And that's why I always feel that storytellers can rest assured that there's a reason for thousands of years that we tell stories, that it continues, because those other characters going to those other worlds through other characters is interesting, and as you said, a distinctly different experience from just yourself immersing yourself into a world, because that's the last part too. I mean, I'm thinking about the last movie of Simon's that I loved and my family loved. It's not just a world creation, because that's not a satisfying experience. It's through characters in a world that draws you in, and that your favorite films and television have to be about both.
Thank you. Holly?
I would, I don't know so much about the video game component here, but I think, particularly with Simon's films, you can see, the visual way that they're shot and the pacing and the sort of reinvention he did of Sherlock Holmes in particular, I think, is influenced by a much more modern sensibility, and maybe unconsciously some of that stuff comes from how we're experiencing the medium these days. But it makes it more alive. It makes it more present. It's more visceral, if you will. Kingsman is a movie also recently that really kind of pushed the envelope a little bit on. It wasn't your parents' James Bond kind of movie. It's very, very visual, and I think it probably owes a little bit to that player experience. But ultimately, everyone's still trying to make a communal come to the theater, or at least sit around on the couch with a bunch of people, but hopefully come to the theater and experience it, because that's one of the things I loved at Film Society, and I still love, is when those lights go down and you're having that group experience. And I don't necessarily want it to turn into Brave New World, where you're going to see feelies. Remember, I don't know if you remember Brave New World, but I was feeling that everything. I remember Earthquake was in Sense Around when I was a very little kid. And there's certainly some of that is fun, but I think still good storytelling is what ultimately always matters, more than what platform you're watching it on, or how it's being put together. On the other side of that, though, the social media aspect and the keeping stuff alive between movies, and especially with the great, one of the nice things that's happened with superhero movies in general is that they're much smarter. If you go back and watch, the Superman TV show, or the Batman stuff, as fun as it was, there's been, giving a much more intellectual and rigorous look at these characters and giving them depth, and the sensibility is so much more interesting now. And that's been a real positive development. The comic book movies are not really comic books.
Well, you look at the filmmakers. I mean, the Chris Nolan, Bryan Singer, a lot of the filmmakers they won Sundance before they were making superhero movies. So they were actually people that came from a character and story background and knew how to tell a small story and still tell small stories on a big stage.
Yeah, I saw that happen quite a bit at Warner Brothers. And, there's very much this let's pluck someone from the indie world who's done something really interesting and give them something that we already know people are going to be interested in seeing, but we'll bring to it a depth and a breadth and an interesting voice and sensibility. And that's great to see when that happens.
Do a lot of filmmakers make that transition successfully?
I think so. I think now more and more also filmmakers understand what it means to accept the keys to a studio car. I mean, they have a lot of creativity, and again, if you look through last year, if you think about Godzilla or some of these other independent filmmakers coming into it who embrace it, it can really work. I think where you find the harder part is, going into a studio movie, you have creativity, but it's also something that's going to be sold around the world and has very financial expectations. So there has to be a real partnership. And oftentimes it works. I think the ones that are tougher are the ones where somebody isn't really ready to make a studio movie or not to do something just independently. That's where it feels like it's a little tougher.
Yeah, coming from the independent world, I think a lot of the filmmakers I've worked with have had, found it really challenging to make that leap into, the studio world. So, Pixar there's published and online their 22 rules of storytelling, which is, a lot of people you can poke at that, and you can find it online. But I'd love to hear your guys, each of your thoughts about, your own rules about storytelling.
See, I'm probably the least successful on this panel because I don't really follow the rule. Like, basically, I
That
kind of
makes you
judge
the most
by,
successful.
I don't know. I think, and I think it's true for all of us, I kind of approach my job, what's interesting, what grabs you? Is it a character? Is it a world? But then I think from the storytelling, it's being clear about what is it, and then how to kind of expand that out and let it be what it is. Because also back to what you're asking about independent filmmaking and studio films, I think that's where you get the dissonance when people aren't making the same film or trying to tell the same story. So Pixar, I mean, those movies are phenomenal, and I agree with that, but I always think it's almost, I remember being at Brown, does film start from theory, or which side does it start from? And so I think to use those tools to evaluate how you're telling your story is valuable, but I think it has to start from the place it genuinely starts from. And I know that sounds very touchy-feely, but it's true. I think that's where you can test it against that as opposed to start from there.
So does the story feel like it resonates?
Does it resonate? Interesting characters. Is it actually about something? Have I seen this a lot of times before? And even if the answer is yes, that's okay, but why does this still grab me? Or, and what kind of story is it? Because I think that's the other part of this new storytelling we're talking about. I think a while back, when it was, is it a movie? That was the question. I don't think that's a question anymore. I think, where does it belong? Taking your story, does that feel like it's best served in the format of a movie, television, a short film, or just something you want to go and make and throw on Vimeo or Facebook or some site?
Or is it a podcast?
Yeah, or a podcast, exactly. So I feel like that's the new model rather than, will it be this? It's taking whatever that piece is and what's the best home for it.
Great.
I think for me, I read Sid Field's screenplay when I was first out in LA and I was writing screenplays myself. I think that the rules haven't necessarily changed so much as the way people break them is something you look for also. You kind of, particularly as a story analyst at a studio, I get a lot of stuff that's familiar. And a little familiar is okay, but there has to be something that's also, the word they use a lot is fresh, but I think something that is a different angle on something you may have seen before, or a reinvention. And at the same time, more than anything else, you want to have an emotional relatability. It's not necessarily likability, but it's got to get you compelled. The character, the predicament, what's going to happen to them. And I always am looking for that. When I open it up and in my mind the lights are going down, how soon am I grabbed? What's grabbing me? And if I'm not grabbed and I'm not emotionally compelled, then there's not a movie in there, I think. So whether it's TV or whatever medium you're looking for, you're always looking for that relatability. And that even if it's, you know, another century or science fiction, the human element of the story has to work.
Yeah, I would say the exact same thing, which is I don't think of stories as stories. I actually approach any movie or idea from the perspective of what is it about for the characters? Like, what is the emotional dilemma of the movie? And then I figure out what world it should take place in, or you know, like in the case of Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which I wrote, it was about a married couple that sort of the spark had been, you know, they'd lost the spark in their marriage, and the way they found it was actually by in conflict with each other. And that could have manifested as ordinary people, or Kramer versus Kramer, or a whole host of different things, but at the core there was something very resonant and real. And in the case of Sherlock Holmes, actually, I think the trappings of that movie felt very modern, and the style of it was very prominent, and that's what people responded to. But when we were working on that script, we didn't have a movie until and when I say we, it was me, Guy Ritchie, and Robert Downey, who was very much involved in the development at that point. We didn't have a movie until we realized what the movie was about was Sherlock having to let Watson go. That it was about a best friend who had become dependent on his younger friend and ruined that guy's life, and had to actually let him go, live his own life, get married. And again, that could have been, you know, it could be a Wes Anderson movie, that could be a Woody Allen movie, or it could be Sherlock Holmes in 19th century London. And so I always approach it from the perspective of, like, what is this movie about? Is this something that a friend could come to dinner and say, hey, you know, so-and-so from Brown, this is what he's going through right now. And that would be interesting at dinner to hear what that person was going through. And if that's not true, then you don't have a story. Because story is a lot of architecture and sort of artifice, building and sort of expressing that core dilemma, that core problem. And that's the thing that also helps. You know, making a movie is hard and long, and if you're lucky, it takes 2 years from the point you have the idea to the point you wrap the movie. And that's lucky, that's fast. So you have to have something that through all of the years, through all the different hands that are going to touch it, through all the people that are going to say no, you keep in mind what the core purpose of the story is. Because all of the sort of twists and turns of the actual storytelling, the narrative, are going to change. They're inevitably going to change because 10, 20, 100, however many people are going to put their hands on it and change it. So you need that core thing to hold on to. And I think in terms of Pixar, I know their list of rules, but I think when you look at their movies, they don't actually adhere to all those rules. And that's part of what's so great about them. The thing that they do that I think is so instructive, and I think studios are doing more of, and TV has always done, is they have a room full of writers. And it is an iterative process where they try a story, they throw it up in like a sort of animation, they watch it, it doesn't work. Those writers go back to the room together, everybody chips in, they just keep building and building and building. Whereas, you know, traditionally in live action features, one writer touches the script, then they fire that writer, they hire another writer, they fire that writer, they hire another writer, they then hire the first writer to come back again. And he has to basically, it's like, you know, touch this script that now a lot of people have messed up without being attached to his or her original version of the script. So it was a terrible process where writers were treated as interchangeable and disposable. And I think that's less true now, partly because of the way television is clearly superior in its writing. I think studios are starting to follow that model more.
Great. So on the film side, often as much as 75% of the gross revenues are coming out of the international marketplace. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on narrative and, you know, how that's affecting the stories that you're telling.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something you really have to consider now. Is it going to work internationally? Because you know, even if you don't consider it, it's being considered down the hall when you have your budget and the various financiers or the studio is thinking about how that works. I mean, I think back to, in a way, what both of you were talking about, that's where it really has to resonate, because I think you can't get away with kind of things that aren't going to play larger, because all of the age-old maxims of comedies don't play internationally, or they're, again, back to what the rules are, and that action does play internationally. That isn't true anymore either. And it's interesting to see what's resonating around the world. On the one hand, it might sound like it's more limiting. I personally find that actually it's been surprising in a good way of things that have worked internationally, that in America, that studios feel like maybe is old hat or this doesn't work anymore, and then they're doing huge business, let's say in China or other places around the world. So it liberates it, but it's a huge part of the conversation now, for sure, whereas before it wasn't. But that's also for the larger budgeted films. I mean, again, back to the first rule is, if you can make it really inexpensively, you have a lot of creative freedom. So that's where international really kicks in, when the budget's kicking in. You have to be thinking about that.
What were some of the sort of more surprising themes that, you know, sort of really resonated and took off internationally that you were surprised about?
Well, I can think of some of the examples. I don't know that there were movies I ran out the first weekend to see, but you know, like there are a couple. I'm just trying to think now, and some that didn't work. But you know, movies like Need for Speed, or some of the action movies that did really huge business in China and didn't really do well here. Or it's just interesting to look at it. Or the things you would expect, Mad Max, or even I love Cinderella, and I think that was great to see how that did so well around the world and here, and this is fun to play critic, is I also think because it's so well made. Like, I actually think that makes a difference, because we also live through a period of, it doesn't matter, just make it and people will see it, and that's not true anymore. The audience is extremely intelligent and discerning, and word of mouth, thanks to social media, where you can't just trick the audience, because even from the movie or wherever they are telling their friends about it, if something's well done, that actually also can equal bigger business. So,
well, I'll jump in on that for 1 second, because I produced Cinderella. That was a really interesting process, because initially when a friend of mine and I brought the notion of doing a live-action Cinderella to Disney, our idea was to do the Pixar version that had adventure and dragons and action, because we felt like that would open it up, and it would open it up to larger than a female audience. And that's what we developed for a year with Disney. And then we hired a director, and at a certain point the director, who didn't end up being the director of the final film, but the director said, why are we doing all this? Why don't we just tell Cinderella? It's like a perfect story. It has survived for centuries in different versions. Why are we going through all of this reimagining for something that fundamentally works? Why don't we just tell the best version we can tell of a live-action Cinderella that nobody's done?
Exactly.
And that's when we were like, oh, that seemed kind of self-evident, but it took a year to figure it out.
The Cinderella story is a story that is, you know, sort of almost every culture has a Cinderella story, which is, you know, another...
You know, as a mother who doesn't want, you know, Cinderella to eat my daughter's life, I was actually deeply appreciative of that. I thought Chris Weitz did a spectacular job with the script, and Kenneth Branagh, an amazing piece of directing. And I didn't feel as a woman that it was all that, you know, somebody's going to have to come rescue you over again. And it was really wonderful to see that take place. But just on the other point of international, you know, what you were saying about conventional wisdom, said comedies don't play overseas. I distinctly remember the moment when The Hangover surprised everyone at being huge overseas, and it wasn't expected to. And it was interesting that was considered sort of, there was something universal about that experience. Even though it's a high concept movie, everyone has a night they regret, so where they behave badly. And it is exciting to see that happen, and it's no more such the case that you can make a real clunker of a science fiction spectacle and expect, well, we'll do fine in China, Brazil, or Japan, and that's okay. I think the standards are all coming up.
By the way, this is the point, too, I get to embarrass our other Brown graduate, and she's not going to let me, but who also did Cinderella extremely well on Broadway. So there you go. There's a Brown Cinderella connection, and I'll let you guys figure that out.
I think maybe more than one.
Exactly.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of the next big trend in storytelling. You know, we talked a little bit about VR and, you know, Oculus Rift and, you know, this using technology to have these immersive experiences. You know, love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, that really is what everyone is talking about right now, about this next form of storytelling, of how it's going to work with this new medium. I mean, everyone is quite obsessed with Magical Leap, you know, all of these different Oculus Rift. They already are spending a fortune. Google is spending a fortune with major filmmakers to figure out how can we tell stories with this new medium, because they're waiting and they know it. It will be interesting to see. It's so immersive. I as a moviegoer, feel that this could be very, very exciting. On the other hand, I'm also the person that can't stand 3D, so I'm probably the worst person to ask, and my kids are the same, but except for rare instances. But I think that even speaks to certain stories bear being told in that way, and that's a great experience. Other stories, it feels like a gimmick to tell it in that. So I think everyone's looking for that perfect fit of what earns itself to be told in that way. But I mean, now we're living in a world of, I think, excellent large-scale science fiction stories, which both can express a universe, but I think also, as we all now are grappling with what technology really means in a very tangible way, both we understand it, we also understand from hacking and other things of how we're also vulnerable. I thought Ex Machina was phenomenal. I don't know if you guys have seen that. We're going to see it in a larger scale in a number of movies. So I actually think the technology that we're talking about for the storytelling is going to intersect with what is really interesting right now in cinema, what we're trying to explore. By the way, in an entertaining way, I'm not only in a semiotic way, both places coming together. So I think that it feels like at the moment there's a giant conversation and exploration of, and both within film, but again, as we know, Google and other companies, technology companies, are really spending a fortune to figure this out right now. Yeah.
I don't know where it's all going, but I know my son, even when he was 3 or 4 and a movie was coming out he wanted to see, he said, "Mommy, what D is it in?"
8D. It's in 8D.
But you know, I also find myself mostly avoiding 3D movies unless I feel like there's a really good reason to see it in 3D and shell out the extra money. And you know, How to Train Your Dragon, sure, because you want to feel like you're flying. But not everything needs to be made that way. The same way movies didn't all need to be in Cinerama when that was new. But it was a cool experience, and some of those movies are really great to be seen that way. You know, I can't imagine Giant or Lawrence of Arabia without that huge screen, that ratio. But at the same time, I think, however we're going to be experiencing the new technology, the stories are going to it's going to be the basic storytelling and how we relate to it as people that's going to ultimately make it compelling and not just a gimmick.
Yeah, I just agree with all that. I think stories have not fundamentally changed from Homer and Sophocles to Shakespeare to Scorsese. I think they're all telling stories in similar ways in different medium. I do think that the 3D thing is interesting. I think there's only really been one 3D movie, maybe two with Life of Pi, the other being Avatar, where the filmmaker actually imagined the movie initially in 3D. And so I think the experience was of seeing the way the filmmaker imagined the film as opposed to a filmmaker that adapted their vision to the technology. And I think that what we can't anticipate yet is what the generation of our kids who grew up on 3D and who see films in 3D in a more organic way than we do, when they become the next generation of filmmaker, they may be imagining their stories in 3D. But I think right now the generation of filmmakers that are making movies in their 30s and up, 20s and up even, didn't grow up on 3D films, and so it's not the way they imagine cinema. And so still, I think, with the exception of those two films, and even Life of Pi, I don't totally put in that category. I know Jim Cameron imagines his movies in 3D. He lives in that technology in a different way. So I think Avatar has to be seen in 3D, because almost the story doesn't work as well in 2D. There's no other film I could really say that about. And again, I just think we can't anticipate it because our brains don't think the way. There were a bunch of kids that are now gone in the front row, but their brains think.
Yeah.
Simon, going back to what you were saying about all of the tentacles of your projects, which is the kind of in your mind the most successful offshoot of one of your films that's happening on another platform?
Well, the one that leaps to mind is I'm involved in the Star Wars movies. And the way that that process began was about 2 years ago. Kathleen Kennedy, who took over Lucasfilm from George Lucas, hired 3 writers. Myself, Michael Arndt, who wrote Little Miss Sunshine and Toy Story 3, and Larry Kasdan, who wrote Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Big Chill. So, and the 3 of us went up to Skywalker Ranch, where George Lucas lives and works, and spent 2 weeks like a writer's room in a TV show, with a whiteboard, eraser, and a pen, coming up with ideas for 5 movies, 7, 8, and 9, and 2 standalone movies in between those. And we, not all of that survived into what they're now doing, but it began in that room. And then the second part of that conversation was they came to me and they said, well, we want to do television shows. And I said, well, I have at the time, I don't know how old they were, 3 and 5-year-old, 3 and, that's not the right math, 7-year-old boy. And I wanted to do a continuation of the Clone Wars show. And so we talked about doing an animated show that would take place in the timeline that would inform between one of the standalone movies we were talking about and Star Wars A New Hope, to educate kids who didn't grow up necessarily on the original Star Wars movies about that universe and those characters. So, and plant things in that and in the standalone movies that would then pay off in episode 7 that's 30 to 40 years later narratively. So that kind of, when I say horizontal storytelling, where you're actually telling a story that takes place, a saga that takes place really with the prequels over the span of 90 years, following a family story. It's the Skywalker story, from Anakin to Luke to what the future films will be. It was exciting as a storyteller because that was a new way of telling story for me. Probably pretty similar to television because it was episodes, chapters. George called them episodes, right? So they were episodes of a larger saga. And within that, there's also, I created that animated show. That's been 2 seasons on the air now, or going in second season. I don't remember. But we have a comic book that's a spin-off of one of the characters, a video game that begins in that world and then pays off in a standalone movie that takes place and comes out in 2018. So it's very, it is its own universe. And if you are super hardcore, you could take in all that material, the way that in that world there are lots of hardcore fans, obviously. And if you're a more casual viewer, you could pick the ones that sound interesting to you, but they have to be told in a way that you don't lose something having not played the video game to level 56. So it's a very different way of telling story, and you have to be able to keep a lot sort of balls in the air in your mind as you're building.
Very exciting. Do you guys have anything to add on that one?
I'm first of all thrilled for you that you're getting to play in that universe.
As I'm a kid playing in it, yeah.
My
It's
friend
fun.
Carrie Zucker over there is head of the store, and she's grew up on Star Wars, and I think it's been a dream come true for her too, to be able to play in that landscape. I see it also at Warner Brothers, for instance. J.K. Rowling has a book that was like a textbook or a book that was required reading at Hogwarts in the Harry Potter books, and now that's going to be the next movie in that universe because, wow, we've got theme parks and we've got so much, Potter websites, and there's just a lot going on. So they can be mined, they can be harvested again and again and again, but hopefully for good reason with fresh creative energy and insight.
And the ride at Harry Potter Land is so awesome.
Luckily, they're opening one in LA too. Really? So, yes, they're building one. They ripped down the Universal Amphitheater. And I think it's going to be there. So Hogwarts is coming.
Money.
Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I want to be more like that when I grow up. Yeah, we're trying to figure that out in a hard movie right now, so I was just thinking, good idea.
Well, this is, I think, a great opportunity to open up to questions. If anybody has, I don't know, do we have any microphones, Donna, if we need that? Okay.
Hi, Dave Margolin, 90 semiotics. So we're Brown, modernity, postmodern, and then there's this 3-part structure that films have to fit into, but TV doesn't. And you kind of touched on how they're different. How much do you think that 3-part structure is sort of this moment now and creating too much rigidity around stories? I know that you've talked about ways in which you can break out of it, which is really interesting. But when you sell something in Hollywood, if it's a movie, you have to fit it into that. And how much is that tamping down the creativity of stories, and how much is TV allowing you to break out of that and not have to force it into the intellectual property of like this kind of like, you know, resolution.
Yeah. Excellent. It's a very good question from the man who's challenging form. I love it. Back to our semiotics classes. I think for the moment, but I'm not a great person to answer this because I literally am always, I feel like I really do live in the here and now. I'm not the best forward thinker, but I do think that breaking form is happening rather than things being either or in film. Look, I mean, like I loved Under the Skin last year. That was one of my absolute favorite movies. And I think that really played with form. But still, you could argue there's still like a narrative, a 3-act classical structure to it, even if it was playing within that. And it feels like, you know, there's expectations. There's also exhibitors, right, who show movies, and it has to be kind of a certain amount of time. There are rules behind the rules behind the rules. But it does feel like whether it's television or like the Jinx, like how we all watch the Jinx, right? Or shows, or even our expectations of what television is. It feels like there interestingly, there are wider boundaries. I'm realizing as I say this, film has been kind of slower because you think about television, you think about animation, right? Where technology we watch it briskly change, and our relationship to characters and storytelling, and film seems slower. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think though, yeah, for the moment, given the structure and the economics, and film being probably the last place that you have to show up at 8 o'clock, and it's not going to be, you know, it being the last place of that, that's probably going to be the last place to change. But I think television is exciting in that way, that things, I mean, in the documentary world where it's prime viewing, it's not relegated to if I have time or just if it's interesting. So
Yeah.
it feels like TV is the place that really can happen.
There's so many fiction elements that are being brought into the nonfiction arena, you know, with recreations and, you know.
The Imposter, that was a great
Yeah.
movie that
And-
that I loved, yeah.
Right, and also 3-act, you know, using the 3-act structure as well.
I mean, what do you think? Because there's, so I'd be curious for you guys. I mean, in terms of 3 acts and structure and storytelling and expectations. I mean,
Well, I think television has changed more than film in that regard, because you know, when we grew up, there were all these TV movies, and the structure of those movies was, the act breaks in those were 7 acts, and you had to always write to that commercial break so that someone would keep watching and not tune away. And you know, I much prefer watching, you know, Silicon Valley or Veep on HBO, where it's just all the way through, and I'm not giving those commercial interruptions or DVRing and skipping, but of course that's how people get the money to make these things. So commercials are still important. But in terms of film, you know, yeah, you can do nonlinear stories, and that's great, but ultimately there is still some semblance, I think you were saying, of that 3-act structure, because ever since the Greeks, it works.
I think it works. I mean, I don't lament it, and I don't think it's a limitation on storytelling. I mean, I look at it the way that sonnets survived a long time. Haikus still survive. If you write well within the form, sometimes the form can actually be part of the artistry. And I think most stories I've seen on stage or on film conform to a 3-act structure, even though they're radically different films that for an untrained eye would feel completely different. But to a storyteller, you would see the act breaks. So I think it works.
Great. Yes, right there.
Hi, I was wondering if the panel could speak to the kind of bleak statistics about women directors in Hollywood, because I feel like there is a sea change happening, but then all these articles keep coming about how things aren't progressing, they're actually getting worse, and I was just wondering if you all felt like, yes, women should be optimistic, and there's hope.
So the question is, can the panel speak to the issue of diversity in Hollywood amongst directors? 17% of films released by Hollywood last year were directed by women, so it's a very small percentage.
yeah. Well, I'll start. This will be the good news. I'm producing a film. We're starting in 5 weeks, which is why I'm having a lot of fun for 48 hours. Directed by two sisters who wrote the script, Laura and Kate Malevy, who are brilliant, who wrote a script. They're going to direct it, starring Kirsten Dunst. And I was walking down Thayer Street and showing the guys a picture at the Avon of the Babadook, which I think is brilliant. I don't know if you guys have seen this film. Jennifer Kent, a new writer, director, really exciting. That said, it's interesting, and it has to be figured out because it's happening in an independent space, but making that leap to, let's say, a studio space is really important. And ironically, I started first at a studio after Brown, and we had a lot of, we made movies with Penny Marshall, Nora Ephron. There was a base of female directors, directing studio-driven movies. I think part of it has to do with what studios are making right now and who wants to direct them. But on the other hand, I think people are acknowledging, or there are people who are realizing we have to acknowledge why there aren't more women directing these studio movies. Or even the movies that women are directing now at studios. It's a smaller margin, but people are invested in doing that. It is happening across other kinds of movies. And the other statistics that I agree that I think are really strange, that in film school it's 50-50 with women and men, or even sometimes 60-40 women to men, but it's not coming out the other side. I think people in Hollywood, or at least I would like to say people that we know in Hollywood, are invested in this and find it alarming and know that something has to change, because there's a strange divide between independent cinema where there are so many more vibrant new voices that women are directing movies, but it's not coming to the studio side. So I don't think we have to despair, but I think it's something, it has to be addressed and opened up for sure.
There's much more parity in documentary filmmaking, for instance. Yeah, but close to 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
Holly, do you have any thoughts?
I think on the studio level, there's a lot of risk involved in these larger budget movies, and the tendency when you're in a decision-making position of who to hire may be something to do with, I want to go with someone who's had a track record before, and so then you keep hiring from the same sort of pool of people. But it's very frustrating to see. When I was at the Ladd Company in the 90s, we made the two Brady Bunch films, and we got women directors for both of those films out of television, Betty Thomas and Arlene Sanford. And Sherry Lansing was head of Paramount at the time, and was kind of jumping up and down that we got women directors. So there was an attempt to be doing that, even with these studio movies. They were lower budgeted for a studio movie, though, maybe not as risky. I just want to see more of it happen. But the other side of the coin, I think, that is that no one really talks about enough in America today, is what it's like to be a working woman and have a family, and how hard that is. I didn't realize it as much till I had twins, but you know how hard it is to be making a movie for 2 years, and the travel involved, and the time away from family. And sometimes women do get caught in that bind of, I want to have it all, but I can't really have it all at once. And there's a lot of moving in and out of those active times in your life where you're really career focused and not. And some people, like Nicole Holofcener in the independent world, has been able to raise a family and make her movies, but it's really hard. And if we lived in Sweden, where there was paid maternity leave and really low-cost quality daycare and social education for everyone, it would be maybe easier for women to keep making that choice again and again and again. But it's difficult to divide yourself. I think to be a mother, someone once said, is to be conflicted, and to want to do your job well and be around for your kids. And particularly me coming to motherhood a little bit later, it's really the reason I'm a story analyst now and not a development executive anymore, or trying to be a screenwriter anymore, because I need that time with my kids, and I still want to do interesting story work with material. But finding that balance has been a challenge even for me, and I'm not a creator. So I imagine it's a lot harder on the stakes level of a big budget movie.
You have a blog, right, Holly?
I have a blog right now called Screen Mom that I just do for fun on the side, because I got to keep my creative writing alive. But also because I really love watching classic films and the films I grew up with my kids. And I think whether you're an uncle, an aunt, grandparent or have your own kids, taking the time to watch with them and talk about the movies and see what turns them on and what turned you on. It's a great bonding experience, and you shouldn't be using the TV and the movie as a passive babysitter. You should be engaging with your kids with it, because your life will be richer for that.
I think a lot of it is what one of you said about studios thinking that they're making a particular kind of movie for a male, predominantly male audience, and so they think that is connected to a male director. I think what will change to some extent is there are a lot of movies now that are hit movies that are a predominantly female audience, like Pitch Perfect 2 and Cinderella and 50 Shades of Grey, and movies that are actually beating the sort of very male, masculine films. And so I think at the end of the day, studios, the weird thing is most studios are actually run, either presence production or chairperson is female. Mm-hmm. So the people that are in the decision-making position are often female. Mm-hmm. It's not a bunch of guys in suits sitting around, conspiring against women. I think that's the way they justify it ultimately, and the thing that they only really care about at the end of the day is making money. Mm-hmm. And if they feel as though tapping into a female audience, even in a movie like Fast and Furious or X-Men or whatever, is as important as getting The Boys Out opening weekend, mm-hmm. they will start to hire more female directors. And so I think ultimately at the end of the day, more movies that come out that do well with a female audience, the better chance there is of more female directors being hired by studios. Mm-hmm. I think most of the people that are running studios are good people, and male or female are actually pretty progressive people. But they are people who answer to a corporate board, and in their mind it's just about making a profit. So that will define more than anything.
Shareholder value trumps everything today, and that's the unfortunate, in some ways, fact of life, although capitalism is a great engine at the same time that raises people up, but it's a compromise. But I also think I would like to see more movies that I can relate to very personally, and that's very hard to come by. I'm not mm-hmm. seeing things come across my desk that are where I'm nodding my head and saying, I've been there. Mm-hmm. And it's frustrating for me that that's the case. Mm-hmm. I love a lot of the big spectacle movies, but I also love, Enough Said. So mm-hmm. I would like to see more of that coming up and seeing those stories find an audience. Mm-hmm. But it's really hopeful when female-driven pictures open and do well, and hopefully that will lead to more of them getting made by men or women.
I'm just going to ask a question that has to do with what you just said. So why aren't they coming across your desk? Why aren't those stories being generated? What's the reason for that?
That's a good question. I mean, there used to be a theory that, women controlled the TV dial, but men decided what they were going to spend the money on to go see at the theater. I don't know if that conventional mm-hmm. wisdom holds at all these days. I hope it doesn't. I don't really know the answer to that. I go support movies like that. I hope that you all will too when you see something. But hopefully, as more women are being bold with their choices in life and leaning in, that we'll see more of that happen.
Part of it might be the growth of the international piece, because the movies that are working on the international front are male-oriented action films mm-hmm. that dominate that. So,
although not necessarily, because 50 Shades of Grey was massive internationally. Yeah, Cinderella was bigger internationally than it was domestically. Pitch Perfect did great internationally. Mm-hmm. Frozen made $1 billion based mostly on international girls. Young women.
That's great. That's
so I actually think that, and in my experience, even on these bigger movies, there is now an attention not just to satisfying an international audience, but also drawing to a female audience. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that the first 2 Star Wars movies, JJ's Episode 7 and the Gareth Edwards one that comes after that, have female protagonists. Mm-hmm. Both of them have female leads that the previous 6 Star Wars movies never had. Mm-hmm. And it's not a coincidence, I can tell you.
And I think the success of Frozen was really, really heartening, because it's so different than most other movies. And particularly, again, as the mother of a little girl, was just tremendously excited to see Disney move in and Pixar move in that kind of direction.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Anybody in the back?
I've been a moviegoer to get
Anyone?
Okay. I actually think that's true, and I think it's interesting because I think it's very relevant to I guess, whatever the stated topic of this today was. I actually think it has a lot to do with new media. I think that especially movies that are for a younger audience, for teenagers, have to compete not with violent video games, but with the internet. And the internet gives kids access to so many inappropriate things that we did not have when we were growing up. And so we were competing with kind of, 10 p.m. television was about as hardcore as what we had to compete with. And now you're competing with, real-time footage of somebody getting shot by a police officer. There's an intensity to the reality that kids are ingesting online that I do think that movies have to compete with to make them feel relevant and not old-fashioned. And so that's the one hand. On the other hand, I think also you're getting younger filmmakers that are coming out of a time when they were raised on that kind of imagery. And so in their minds, again, the way they see the world, not everything's strategic, some of it is artistic. The way they see the world is through the lens of a live time, first person, violent perspective. And I think that's informing their artistry.
Video games. Do we have time for one more?
One more.
Okay, yes, sir.
I may be prejudiced because I come from the time when television was considered the wasteland. But I want to know your views. If I have to choose between a movie and television, I go to the movie because I assume time has been taken to make a really good product. Or I feel, and I could be wrong, that a television show is based on we've got to get it out by Friday night. Could you comment on it?
I think it's really changed. I mean, by the way, television, what happens now, not only how much time goes into a show, because I think in the past, and I'm speaking, this is not from personal experience, in the past, they had a very short window to make a show, how they do it. Now they have much more time. They have giant budgets. I mean, when you hear what even just Ray Donovan on Showtime, what you hear the budgets are for a regular show that has 10 episodes, it's a giant budget in terms of what a movie budget would look like. I mean, it's such high quality that's happening on television. I mean, what I like, personally, what I think we're seeing in television as a viewer, and I feel like as a producer, is you really can take things much further. You're not worried in television right now, even with independent studios, the fear of losing the audience is intense. In television, I revel in meetings when they say, how do we take this further? How do we really challenge the audience? This needs to be wilder. I mean, they're really, not only are no limits, is they're looking to be talked about, so they're gonna put a lot of time. So I think television is a really a phenomenal medium right now because you can see things that are maybe even sometimes a little bit less polished or have to fit a certain type of form. So yeah, I would urge you to experiment both. But the last thing I have to say too, God, I'm gonna be on a soapbox, is the same with independent movies. Somebody was touching on why aren't these movies working? All of us who make films, I mean, I'm a broken record on Facebook, especially with the smaller movies, they can't get made if people don't go. So that's the other part of the economics that we all talk about, and here's how it has to work. We're all part of that. So I think when you say what I want to see, I think people have to go see what they want to see, because that also then goes back to the people that we're working with to say, yes, there's an audience for that. So I think there's a cycle that we all acknowledge and are all a part of. So when you say I choose this movie or I choose television, that actually is being watched and probably overly tracked in ways that terrifies us. So we know it, and it's power that you have in terms of what you want to see, and financiers hearing that.
I mean, a symptom of that is my husband works at NBC, and they're doing a sitcom Undateable that they brought back. Every episode's going to be live next year, because that's not an experience you can get binge watching on Netflix. Cool. So they want you to still have some appointment television and come see, because they need to sell ads. And we'll see what this tendency toward live shows where you can participate also at home and on the web is really, really big happening in TV. And so everyone's just competing for your eyeballs and your butts and seats, whether it's on the couch at home or in the theater and trying to make you compelled, because you can be looking at Facebook and many other choices with your time. So that's, I think, the big challenge with viewership changing and movie habits going to movies changing, how we can still compel people to come and find stories that are compelling for that reason.
I actually don't think that TV and movies compete. I think that in-the-house activities and out-of-the-house activities are diametrically different. I remember when I was a kid and the VHS was invented, and it was like, that's going to kill movies because you can watch movies at home. Didn't. Cable TV, that's going to kill movies because you can watch movies at home. It didn't. DVDs. Every time going to the movies is like when we went around the campfire, when we went to see, the guy telling the story in the cave, when we go to the theater when it was cheap, and it was the only way that you'd see narrative performed. There is a communal experience. There is a date night or family night experience to movies that is always going to feel different because you are leaving your home to go to an event and to go to a communal event. And I just think that there is a specialness to that. I think movies compete with theater. I think movies cannibalize theater. And I think the only thing that has changed about that and will change as we see it is now we have something that is an in-home and out-of-the-home activity on our phones, which is the internet and email. And I think we've never had before something that was transportable that way. It was either you watch narrative at home or you saw it in the theater. You didn't watch it sitting in, the taxi or the train or whatever, or in line. And so I think the challenge for movies, as it is for TV, is to undistract people. We are such a distracted society now. We're so distractible that you have to create a story that somebody who is checking their phone all the time has to turn their phone off for 2 hours. That's like a punishment to a child. So you have to make it good enough that it doesn't feel like they're being punished for 2 hours.
Absolutely.
I think that's a wrap for today. So thank you so much, you guys. Thanks, audience. Good job.